assuming this is recorded and available later, to this symposium on Gregory Collins's book, Commerce and Manners in Edmund Burke's Political Economy. We're grateful to the Center for the Study of Representative Institutions for equipping us for this, what to say, 3 or 4 part homage, act of gratitude to the achievement of Greg Collins's book. It has had precursors, and just going over some in my mind, I recall a chapter in Gertrude Himmelfarb's book, The Idea of Poverty, the 4 remarkable and suggestive chapters that comprise the central section of Donald Winch's book, Riches and Poverty, P.J. Marshall's recent and comprehensive book, Edmund Burke and the British Empire in the West Indies. But Gregory Collins's book that we'll be talking about today is the one that will define and set the terms of argument for a generation, I think, on Burke's economic ideas and their relationship to his political thought regarding manners and morals. We'll be, as I said, expressing appreciation of the book and to do so in the academic way, pointing out not only how much it has achieved, but also asking some questions and possibly offering a criticism or two. Let me, as moderator, and I think I forgot to introduce myself, it's as the name is spelled, David Bromwich, and I'm a professor of English at Yale University. Greg's book begins with 2 generous chapters on Burke's thoughts and details on scarcity, a state paper drafted for William Pitt in 1795 and never exactly intended for publication, but it has become part of the Burke canon ever since the early 19th century. A pamphlet dealing with market economy at some length at a crisis for the perpetuation of such an economy in England. In this pair of chapters, Collins notices what he calls the general symmetry between Edmund Burke and Adam Smith, but also some ways in which Burke's ideas of market liberty were a pattern for the libertarian doctrine of Friedrich Hayek. He goes on to treat Burke's speeches on economic reform of 1780 and 81 in 2 chapters. Sorry, that's just 1 chapter, I believe. But Burke at the really height of his intellectual powers and political influence, and discusses there how his economic proposals fit in with his theory of political representation and reform. There are then 3 chapters on trade with the American colonies and with Ireland, and 2 further ones. These are not merely regional studies, but continuations of the general sketch of Burke's self-modification and consistency throughout his thinking on political economy. 2 chapters on Burke's criticism in the 1780s of the abuse of commercial conduct in India through the delegated monopolistic power assigned to the British East India Company. This touches on both Burke's early policy, his formulation of a radical reform idea in the 1780s, and his later representation of the depth of the abuse in the impeachment of the Governor General of Bengal, Warren Hastings. The book finally it culminates with 2 chapters by Collins that deal with Burke's analysis of the treatment of property and money in the French Revolution as symptoms of a new species of tyranny, and as Burke saw it, sinister agreement between the political economy of the revolutionists and their recklessly innovative definition of natural rights. Let me just take note of one feature of the Burke-Smith relation that others are, I suspect, going to talk about in greater depth. Burke had enormous admiration for the economic views of Smith in The Wealth of Nations, and this high regard was mutual. Smith said that Burke was, quote, the only man I ever knew who thinks on economic subjects exactly as I do without any previous communication having passed between us. So let's take Smith's word for it. Burke was always thinking about political economy. And indeed, one could go further and say of him, as of few other politicians or political theorists, that he was always thinking. What has sometimes been challenged with reason is the consistency of his thoughts and policies. And in this area, unfortunately, Burke is no help because he could never admit that he had been wrong. The tenor or temper of his economic pronouncements is extremely various if you cast your eye over his entire career, whatever the steadiness of the underlying doctrine. And I'll just cite here two passages. The first from that great speech on Fox's India Bill of 1783, in which Burke talks about the responsibilities of the British imperial government under the East India Company in Bengal, a region covering, he says, 281,412 square miles. Burke is not averse to precision of detail. And he adds, through all that vast extent of country, there is not a man who eats a mouthful of rice but by permission of the East India Company. 12 years later, in the thoughts and details on scarcity, another season of near famine, this time in England, you find Burke saying, and this is a quotation from that work, under the pressure of the cares of our mortal condition, men have at all times and in all countries called in some physical aid to their moral consolations, wine, beer, opium, brandy, or tobacco. Now, those two statements are not contradictory, but when I said they were of different tenors or tempers, I meant that they expressed a very different judgment or sentiment in view of the suffering of ordinary people. In the first case, we could call it indignation. In the second case, acceptance. And this is one sort of tension within Burke, or one aspect of the complexity he had to work through in a political career that involved economics that I think we'll be touching on today. Let me now introduce our three speakers, and then we'll go straight into the discussion. The speakers will talk, each of them, for 20 minutes or a bit less. They may pose questions for Greg Collins, which he'll answer at the end, and we'll conclude with his response to all three speakers. I should say my intention as moderator is only to be timekeeper and say something now and then if I have any worthwhile point to interject. So first, I'll introduce them in order. Samuel Moyne is the Henry R. Luce Professor of Jurisprudence at the Yale Law School and Professor of History at Yale. He is the author of three major studies of human rights: The Last Utopia, Christian Human Rights, and Not Enough, a study of human rights and inequality. Harvey Mansfield is the William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Government at Harvard University. He is the author of Statesmanship and Party Government, a study of Burke and Bolingbroke, and of Taming the Prince on executive power, and the book Manliness. He's also an admired translator and wide-ranging interpreter of the writings of Machiavelli. Jesse Norman is Member of Parliament for Hartford and South Hertfordshire, and is the author of an excellent short intellectual biography and interpretive essay on Edmund Burke. I mentioned the fact that it is a short biography because not all biographies of Burke have been short. And also, I should say, the author pertinent to our discussion today of an interpretive biography of Adam Smith. So with that, I leave it to our panelists, and we'll start with Samuel Moyne.
Excellent. So I'm going to speak far more briefly than David forecast, and for a couple of principled reasons. First is that with my deep apologies, I have to sign off early because of another of these infernal Zooms. This one I'm looking forward to, and I really want to maximize the time that I hear from others, and especially from Greg. And so I'm gonna, as was proposed in our preparations, just pose a few questions. The second reason is that I'm a rank amateur on this topic. I don't purport to any expertise. I know Jesse Norman, and just before we began the public portion of this, said he's a mere politician, but he's written a book on Burke like the other panelists and the chair, and so I have not. I work in the 20th century. I've read Greg's book forensically, and I really just want to ask him a few questions based on the few things I do know. To begin with, Greg has, I think, a very considerable achievement to boast in this book. As David said, it's not only pioneering substantively, but it's on every page erudite, fair-minded, and well-written. And it's actually there that I want to begin with the first of my three questions. It's a question really about, for Greg, about how he devised this study and what the benefits and costs of organizing it the way he did were. So most clearly, as you read this lovely book and learn from it on every page, Greg set out to write something comprehensive about the way that economics and economic thinking figured in Burke's career across at least much of its expanse, and therefore over decades. At the same time, he doesn't organize the study chronologically, or there was a choice made not to start at the beginning and proceed to chart change over time, at least as the sole principle of organization, because Greg too wants to engage a kind of burning debate. It's been burning, but I've seen it burn in my amateurish kind of monitoring of the literature in even the past few years about how we think about Burke's ongoing reflection in these critical years after the French Revolution explodes. And in particular, of course, that commits Greg in what David properly said is the culmination of this fine book to reckon with the so-called Edmund Burke problem, named after the Adam Smith problem, which would be the chestnut, I suppose, of how to fit together the more straightforwardly political and in particular anti-revolutionary writings of the period after 1789 with the thoughts on scarcity. And so the question I want to ask in this regard is not whether the kind of desire to be comprehensive and the desire to engage with the burning debate about the last few years of Burke's authorship are at war. They're not. And I think you capitalize on the virtue of doing the comprehensive study and showing us all the continuities in Burke's career, not least his dogged commitment to the importance of private property and so forth. And yet, the experience of the reader as a result of the organizational choice that Greg made is to engage the thoughts on scarcity right away, and then wait, really for the balance of the study. And so I just like to kind of, hear from Greg kind of directly, not whether there were costs to being comprehensive, because I don't think there were. And, for the example of the India chapter that David mentioned, is an excellent one for reminding us of just what is to be gained by the comprehensive choice. At the same time, it would be excellent to hear how we fit together the continuities over the decades that are accumulating in much of the study with the last few chapters on the post-revolutionary period. So that brings me to my second question, which really kind of bears on how much and how well and also how difficult it is to register the changes that are setting in the very years when Burke sets himself to write the thoughts on scarcity. And for the analyst, the challenge accrues of fitting together the reflections and other related writings with the thoughts on scarcity. So in these years, based on the kind of broadest secondary literature on political economy in these years, we know that the old moral economy assumptions of the 18th century and before are in transition. I gather we don't think any longer that Burke was responding in particular to the Speenhamland scheme that someone like Karl Polanyi made famous in thinking about this era, but coming through in Greg's presentation is that because of the circumstances in the economic history of Britain in the 1790s, the whole issue of subsistence for politics for basic necessities is incredibly pertinent, even as political economy is shifting away from kind of the old moral economy constraints that may have existed before. At the same time, as Gareth Stedman Jones emphasizes in a book I quite like called An End to Poverty, the French Revolution is utterly critical for changing at least lots of people's expectations for what kind of abundance and what kind of constraints we have to accept in a post-revolutionary economy. So once again, the 1790s, whatever has come before in Burke's own thinking, are destabilizing so many assumptions and make this moment when there either is or isn't an Edmund Burke problem kind of distinctive for the world and therefore potentially distinctive for Burke. And then finally, of course, in this same period across the water, we have to have a debate about what's actually going on in France. And maybe this isn't exactly a criticism I'd make of Greg, but I'll just say that there's not a lot of inquiry into what the French are actually doing in political economy after 1789. And again, based on my own amateurish understanding, it seems as if recent historians insist that there's quite a lot of change over time, even in the short few opening years of the French Revolution. And indeed, ironically, given what Burke has to say, there are a lot of free market ideologies at work in the French Revolution, even if it's also true that we have, scary figures like Gracchus Babeuf on the horizon, and theories that are going to go far beyond debates about subsistence floors to redistribution for the sake of equal distribution. So all that's to say that when the book comes to a head in the culmination in the last couple of chapters, I wanted to get even more from Greg in a way, even though this is quite a long book, about the distinctive features of this fascinating moment in which Burke finally writes his main intervention on kind of economic theory, which of course is the setting in which we'll acknowledge there is such an Edmund Burke problem and solve it in one way or other. So then I come to my third comment or question in this, and it's really about, again, features of the thoughts on scarcity I just wanted to ask you about, because I wasn't sure how well you reckoned with that, how distinctive that text is, as well as some comments I've seen made about it in recent literature. So first, as you emphasize throughout, Burke is moving along, you might say, with the economy of the 18th century from a theory that revolves around landed property to one that's increasingly registering the significance of mobile property and the modernization of economic relations in the 18th century. And yet, as you insist, most of the remarks about the economy in the reflections on the revolution in France are about landed property and what the French have chosen to do with it, not least the expropriation of the lands of the Catholic Church. And so this fact, I just wondered if it should bear more on thinking about how we connect the anti-revolutionary theory of that and text and other texts with the thoughts on scarcity, which seems oriented to these much more modern features like the wage market and the consequences of the credit revolution and so forth. So that's one feature of the thoughts on scarcity. I just wanted to ask how you integrated that into your story. And then second, kind of inspired by some recent articles, which I think you may cite one and not the other, one by Corey Robin and one by Ryan Walter, to ask about value theory in the thoughts on scarcity, because it isn't exactly an emphasis of your interpretation of the thoughts on scarcity that Burke really is concerned with thinking about the source of value. And of course, what would stand out from that perspective is that he doesn't seem to hew to a labor theory. David's emphasized that you've done excellent work reminding us of the relations of Burke and Smith. But of course, Smith held some form of the labor theory of value, and we can debate what it was and what its significance was. And yet in the thoughts on scarcity, that doesn't seem present. Rather, Burke seems to be approaching an almost marginalist theory of value. So I wanted more of Greg's thoughts about, whether that's true, first of all, and what its significance is, if true. So I'll stop there just to close by saying how much, as an outsider, especially as an outsider, I got from the opportunity to read this wonderful study, and even more to listen to my betters engage it and Greg respond.
I had planned to go on straight to Harvey Mansfield, but I wonder, Greg, would you like to respond briefly while Sam is in earshot to at least a brief response to those criticisms, and then we'll go on. I have plenty of time.
That's a good idea. Also, be fresh in my memory as well.
Exactly.
Well, thank you, Sam, for those probing comments. I do have to say, first of all, your background is far more intimidating than my background. I'm surrounded by my 3-year-olds, Stimels and Barney and whatnot. So I hope my response reaches the erudite level that emanates from your surroundings. And Sam, don't sell yourself short. In one of my first conversations with you after an event at Yale, you listed a string of secondary literature on Burke, including Burke's economic thought. I believe that was very impressive. So don't sell yourself short. With regard to your remarks, let's see. First, in terms of the structure of the book and why I chose to discuss thoughts and details on scarcity first. One reason is perhaps explained by my background as a political theorist, historian of political thought. Actually, I would say more the former. My motivation, as you suggested, was not to outline a chronological progression of Burke's thoughts spanning from the 1760s when he entered Parliament through to the 1790s, but impose a more normative framework, if I may use that phrase, to understand his economic thought by first outlining the fundamental economic principles, comparative price system, thoughts on value, his comments about invisible hand type phenomenon, and then conceptually move our way up into the more philosophical, moral arguments that culminate in reflection on the Revolution in France. So that was the first and foremost my motivation behind starting with thoughts and details on scarcity. The cost is that, in my judgment, in order to understand someone's thought, that's the best way to do so. Start at elementary principles and then move your way upward. Or you can reverse Amendment 4 and start at the principles on the surface level and then reach downward to explore more fully the depth, the philosophical foundations of his thought. And I thought first starting with his comments on market economies and then integrating at the end his more philosophically and morally inspired thoughts on market economies would provide that full conceptual lens. Now, the drawback of that is that, as you may have suggested as well, it could unintentionally convey that thoughts and details on scarcity was the central text of Burke's thought, the central text of his political economy, and also as this idea could be further fueled by my rigorous devotion to this text, which, as Dave, as you mentioned earlier, was not even intended to be published, originally published for public consumption, but it was a policy memo, as we say, to government officials. Those are the drawbacks of that decision to start with thoughts and details on scarcity. However, in the true Burkean framework, Burkean spirit, there are trade-offs to all these sort of decisions that one has to make when writing a book. And I thought, ultimately, if my goal was to explore, elucidate, clarify the principles of his political economy, with the understanding that Burke was not simply a statesman, but also a keen political thinker, I would argue a philosopher, that was the best way to do so. And I'll leave it to the readers to determine whether that was the best decision or not. But that was my thinking behind starting with thoughts and details on scarcity. I should also mention in my introduction, I made sure to include to remark that thoughts and details should not be regarded, even though it's commonly referred to as the central text of central and primary economic text of Burke's corpus. It certainly did not cover the full range of his thoughts on political economy, which includes thoughts on foreign trade and his more deeper reflections on the Revolution in France. Let's see. Yes, and also to your point, the French Revolution's conception of political economy in many ways did, and this is actually, I started the book this way, did in some ways embrace, at least originally the revolutionaries, the free market sympathies that Burke displayed in Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, as inspired by the physiocratic notions of conceptions of rationalism, and they spread a more doctrinaire idea of a free internal grain trade that sought to conform man's activities to this wider notion of nature, as they called it. And then later in the revolution, of course, which is what partly inspired Burke to pen Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, was the lurch towards price controls, additional meddling into the French economy in the 1793-1794 period, which predated Burke's drafting of Thoughts and Details in 1795. And so therefore I suggest, maybe incurring some responses, but as frequently as Burke is pitted against the French Revolution, at the very least in this dimension, there were sympathies that overlapped about the possible counterproductive, intrusive nature of interventionist approaches to, at the very least, the free internal grain trade, which is the object of discussion in Burke's Thoughts and Details on Scarcity. And then this leads into the broader, his broader analysis, which I'm sure we'll get to later, about how for him, of course, this should be integrated in a wider moral, religious, and social framework, which for him, the French revolutionaries did not retain when they were trying to impose this conception of a free grain trade in France at that time. And then that leads me to my response to your additional well-taken point about clear integration of how Thoughts and Details on Scarcity relates to reflections on the Revolution in France. Emma Rothschild wrote a very good book, Economic Sentiments, and she argued that there is a divergence, a dissonance between Burke's embrace of the free internal grain trade in Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, in addition to his remarks in that text about the use of government is best as a restraint, not as a meddler. She contrasts that with in her judgment, a more interventionist approach in the reflections on the Revolution in France. I had a few paragraphs to devote to this in my original manuscript, and I cut some out, but I devote one paragraph to this in the book. And I argue that I don't think there is a departure from Thoughts and Details, I would say from Reflection on the Revolution in France, which was written before Thoughts and Details, to Thoughts and Details on Scarcity. Because Thoughts and Details on Scarcity did not provide, as has been said before, did not provide a comprehensive statement of Burke's conception of political economy. It was an ad hoc, it was originally intended as an ad hoc letter written for an ad hoc time period, social and economic dislocation in the mid-1790s, which is why it's important, as I try to emphasize in the book, to weave that into, integrate that with, synthesize it with his other reflections, including most importantly, Reflections on the Revolution in France, in which he outlines his firm conception of the importance of landed property to provide that social stability for the turbulence, the vagaries of commercial economies. And I'm happy to discuss that relationship later as well. Yes, and to your final point about Corey Rubin and Burke's theory of his more or less repudiation of the labor theory of value in Thoughts and Details on Scarcity. That is certainly an implication of his judgment that the value of commodities derives from the consumer, not the producer. Now, this itself has been criticized by classical economists, and it also is criticized, I would say, not only by liberals but conservatives, for demeaning the integrity of industry in itself as a worthy human pursuit, as opposed to pursuing it insofar as it is an instrumental means to producing value, profit for others. In Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, this is certainly what he conveys. One can, I would say, connect the dots with some of his other writings to suggest that there is a conception of property as having worth in itself that was not simply valued, or should not simply have value simply because it produced a profit. And I'm thinking of his defense of the monasteries and the Reflections, his embrace of cautious improvement of estates, which, even if they did not fully maximize the value of their land, provided steady improvement, the amelioration of the land, while also preserving this wider conception of the importance of stability of the states populating England at that time. And there's another tidbit that I came across in David mentioned P.J. Marshall's new book on Edmund Burke in the British West Indies, in which there was a unpublished memo, unpublished fragment that hinted at Burke's rejection of Locke's idea that someone can have a claim to property, someone has a rightful claim to property because they mix their labor with the natural resources. And so he's pushing against this idea in this fragment in that book, which suggests that there is this additional dimension to Burke that did not simply reduce all economic activity simply to profit maximization. And so that's how I would provide some nuance to his understanding of value in Thoughts and Details on Scarcity.
Thank you, Greg. I think we'll go to the next speaker, who is Harvey Mansfield.
Yes, thank you, David. This is quite a book that you've written, Greg, and for its quality, comprehensiveness, for its simple size, it's too much for an author so young as you are. And to think, too, that this is your dissertation. To compare, I wrote a dissertation on Edmund Burke, which came out as a monograph, and it was written on just one tract of Burke's and not on everything that he wrote, as you've done. So it's going to take an effort in which I'll have to gather my faculties, aided by extreme old age, to attempt a critical question. But first, I want to insert an item of bibliography that to the list that David Bromwich gave, and that's a book by Francis Canavan called The Political Economy of Edmund Burke. So Father Canavan was a lifelong student of Burke, whom I knew well, and I would like to mention that book, which is indeed mentioned by Greg Collins. So let's see. Now you emphasize, of course, the friendship and the association between Burke and Adam Smith, and that makes perfect sense. They were friends, they were contemporaries, and had very similar thoughts on economics, especially according to Smith. But I want to mention a man who was a little younger than these two, not much, and that is Montesquieu, whom I've been looking at recently, who also wrote on commerce. His book, his great book, The Spirit of the Laws, came out in 1748. And Montesquieu speaks also of commerce and manners, and offers the thesis that commerce softens people. It makes a society mild or doux, sweet even, as opposed to the harshness of the virtuous ancient republic. Virtue is something that makes you seek perfection. And when you don't find perfection, your desire for perfection makes you want to punish lapses from perfection. So virtue turns out to be punitive or punitiveness. And you see this in the ancient republic, according to Montesquieu, as well as in Christianity and other religions. So, and Montesquieu was, there was also a great enemy of Christianity, and that is Machiavelli. In his book on, in one of the books, I think it's book 21 of The Spirit of the Laws, he makes the remark that we begin to be cured of Machiavellianism. Machiavellianism is violence with strokes of authority, so as opposed to the laws and practices of commerce, if not of economics. Commerce requires that one be willing to negotiate. A recent president of ours wrote a book called The Art of the Deal. In order to get a deal, you have to trade. And in order to trade, you have to trade off. And to make a deal, a principle gets in the way. A principle is what you won't trade or what you won't abandon. There might be a principle of trade, which is not to have a principle. Everything is for sale. Well, Montesquieu ended with the idea of self-interest as opposed to the passions that principles arouse. So this was 1748 that the book came out first, and that was 30 years before the French Revolution. The French Revolution was characterized by both principle and violence. Therefore, one could present it as a failure of the softening that commerce, failure of commerce to soften the societies that Montesquieu criticized before this one. The French Revolution seems to issue commands and when it's violence, saying, go against the laws of commerce. Whereas Burke defends commerce. But isn't he required to find a stronger force than commerce to do this? Since the French Revolution, about which he wrote so wonderfully, seems to challenge the whole idea of commerce, at least according to Montesquieu. And so Greg Collins on page 531 of his book says, Burke puts the honor of nations above the wealth of nations. How can you put the laws of commerce in terms of honor? That seems to be a difficulty and a real problem today, too. Today, we see in many fields the irresistible force of economics. In my field, political science, and my colleagues in political science here have given themselves over as the servant or the slave of political economy. And yet, I've also never seen such anger among my colleagues as I do today in the issues of the day. Anger is a non-economic passion. There are two things to avoid if you want to follow the laws of commerce. First is never get angry, and the second is never fall in love, because both of them make claims against your self-interest. And on the other side, what are accusations of racism and sexism, but demands to satisfy and punish violations of honor? So there's a grand dispute even today between wealth and honor. Is it so readily resolved as by Burke in your fine book? That's my question.
Thank you.
Since Professor Mansfield has been so compact, not to say economical in his remarks, I think we'll follow the pattern I had not originally planned to do and ask you, Greg, to respond briefly to this, and then we'll go on to Jesse Norman's comments.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Harvey, as well. Harvey served as an outside informal advisor for this project. So early on, he was aware of the Freeport Act of 1766, which was one of maybe the first major, legislative achievement of Burke regarding political economy when he entered Parliament, which established new free trade ports between British West Indies and the American colonies. So to get to your question, and this, I guess I will explain the fundamental philosophical argument that Burke makes, that I think Burke makes with regard to his idea of political economy that was raised by Harvey's question, the relationship between wealth and honor. You have reference to Montesquieu's due commerce thesis, whether commercial transactions tend to promote peace, reduce antagonistic tensions between parties, both nations and individuals throughout time. When I started this project, I thought Burke was certainly supportive of this idea, the due commerce thesis. And we see in Harvey comments today, we see this argument often discussed when free trade versus protectionist arguments are raised about whether the reduction of trade barriers between otherwise antagonistic hostile nations will in fact tend to promote peace and provide incentives that lower costs between the two to establish relations that otherwise would be more likely to engage in warfare. Here's what I propose in my book, and I'll admit I'm still thinking about these concerns as well when thinking about Burke. Burke embraced this idea with particular qualifications and preconditions. He thought due commerce was, well, first of all, in Thoughts and Details, he more or less embraces this idea that mutual voluntary contracts between farmers and laborers in the agricultural economy, they do tend to promote a synthesis of interest. And so rather than the arbitrary state government trying to regulate these contracts, there's a social, economic harmony and a social harmony that emerges between voluntary participants. And this argument we see in Adam Smith's work as well, in Classical Economists. With regard to foreign trade, this is more difficult. And maybe reading this book, the reader can sort of detect my own wrestling with this idea in Burke's thought. In a nutshell, one, he did not reject this idea of due commerce in the foreign arena, but he thought that this idea necessitated precondition, moral, religious, cultural preconditions that would have provide this foundation for due commerce to actually take off and accelerate, which is why he was insistent on promoting free trade within the British Empire with some qualifications to placate the particular interests of British subjects in the colonial dependencies. This is why, so with regard to free trade, I mentioned the Freeport Act of 1766, his promotion of free trade between the American colonies and Great Britain, and even probably most famously his promotion of free trade between Ireland and England in the 1770s. But his idea of due commerce, I argued, did not apply for nations outside the British Empire and that had traditionally had a hostile antagonistic antagonistic rivalry with England, most notably France. I identify two instances which he does not, which he more or less rejects the idea of due commerce with regard to France. And that was in regard to the Anglo-French Commercial Treaty in 1786 and the Speech on Traders Correspondence Bill in 1793, I believe, during the French Revolution. These two pieces of legislation were efforts to promote, the first was an effort to promote trade between England and France. The second was a piece of legislation intended to limit economic transactions between England and France. And this is again during a time of war. For Burke, because France was England's foremost commercial rivalry throughout the 18th century, he did not think that expanding commercial relations between these two parties would promote peaceful relations between England and France. And so he therefore supported the Speech on Traders Correspondence Bill and opposed the Anglo-French Commercial Treaty of 1786. For him then, France did not hold these necessary preconditions in the foreign arena that would allow antagonistic nations to establish peace relations under the due commerce thesis. That is a distinction I draw in my book that again I wrestled with when writing it, when researching it, but that's a conclusion I drew. Now today, how does this apply? Retaining this line of consistency, one would think that Burke would support some free trade agreements. But Harvey, to your final point about the prioritization, the relationship between wealth and honor. For Burke, and this clearly comes out in his commentary on the French Revolution, including his commentary on some of these legislation on economic transactions between France and England. For him, of course, religion, morals served foremost priority over economic transaction, commercial prosperity in defending the honor of Great Britain, and for him, promoting a conception of justice and virtue throughout Europe. If this idea of honor necessitated the diminishment of commercial prosperity, then he was certainly sympathetic to that idea, which does suggest a division between him and some classical liberal libertarians who tend to highlight the importance of commercial prosperity, rising standards of living over other considerations of the general welfare. That is how I interpreted his views on the relation between wealth and honor. In fact, he specifically mentions the idea of honor in that Speech on Traders Correspondence Bill as warranting priority over expanding commercial relations and promoting public prosperity.
Can I interject one question that comes out of the exchange you and Harvey Mansfield have just had, since Mansfield brought up chivalry by talking about Montesquieu and honor as opposed to virtue. This becomes a complex and I think possibly confusing element of the most famous passage in the Reflections on the Revolution in France. And it's got to be a sentence you have turned over in your mind, Greg, a good many times. And I just wondered what you would say about it in this context. The unbought grace of life, the cheap defense of nations, the nurse of manly sentiment and heroic enterprise is gone. And those two opening phrases, unbought grace, the first being about commerce, the second about honor, and cheap defense, which seems to be all about measure and economy in the modern sense. Burke could be accused by a hostile critic, which none of us is. Maybe Sam is half a one, but it could be accused of wanting to have it both ways. And, I wonder, I'm thinking about an interesting, pithy observation on Burke by Halevi in his book on economic radicalism, philosophic radicals, where he speaks of Burke's half utilitarian, half mystical philosophy. Does that help you to make some sort of negotiation between honor and virtue? Or what do you make of the mystical part? Do what you will with that.
Yeah. No, thank you. And maybe this will lead into Jesse, your comments as well. So one, I should mention, in the spirit of your comments, David, the great intellectual historian John Pocock, we're familiar with him. He posited probably the most, in my view, the most influential argument about Burke's political economy that I find persuasive, that I mentioned in my book. He wrote a seminal article on Burke's political economy in the French Revolution. His argument, for those who are listening and who are unaware of his thesis, is that Burke more or less reversed the Scottish Enlightenment historiography of the rise of commercial society. And going back to the du commerce thesis, in Pocock's rendering, Smith, Hume, the Scots, not so much Anne Ferguson, who's probably closer to Burke than the other two, but the Scottish Enlightenment philosophy suggested that the rise in civility in modernity, insofar as we have been are civil, derived from the emergence of commercial prosperity, along similar lines as a du commerce thesis, that if two antagonistic parties find some mutual agreement between one another in the fulfillment and satisfaction of goods and services, then that will reduce tensions and promote peace and harmony, and therefore lead to what thinkers at the time called polished manners, civility. For Pocock, and again, I find this convincing. I'm interested for the other panels to see if you're convinced by it as well. He reversed this causal arrow. For Burke, he thought that, David, to your comment, chivalry, as Burke defined it, a distinction of ranks, the ancestral stability of the landed aristocracy, hereditary aristocracy, and religious establishments, the spirit of a gentleman, and the spirit of religion, as he called it, those elements established the necessary preconditions for the rise of commercial society. So those parts of society, they established this element of civility. And then that social stability allowed for the rise of commercial prosperity in modernity. That is a distinction Pocock draws. I find it convincing as well. And this is not to say that the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers were averse to the moral dimensions of political economy. Of course, Smith himself was a professor of moral philosophy, and they were certainly profound in that regard. But at the very least, I think there is that distinction to be made between the two. But I'm open to different interpretations of that issue. Yes, the unbought grace of life and utilitarianism, mysticism. I mentioned that phrase, I believe, in the acknowledgement section of my book. And I found out Yuval Levin, after the fact, Yuval Levin mentioned that phrase in his acknowledgement section of his book. So it is such a great phrase that I think captures Burke's central philosophical argument about political economy, which was that there are more things about life than political economy. And some things cannot be reduced to commodification, monetization, utilitarian instrumentalism, and And those things in life, therefore, should not be up for the market, for profit. This is one reason why he famously denounced the idea of a voluntary contract, a temporary contract, in the Reflections on the Revolution in France. This is one of his most famous arguments, that social relations transcend interim, ad hoc, expedient engagements with one another. There's certainly an element of that in society, as evidenced by Burke's defense of market economies and thoughts and details and other instances in his life. But there's far more to life than that. And to reduce all human relations to those elements of commodification, utilitarianism, drains that idea of grace and dignity from society. Now, was an element of utility in Burke's thought? Absolutely. That's one of the premises of Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, that free market of grain does produce rising standards of living, commercial virtues, et cetera, between market participants. I do think there's a tendency to read modern conceptions of modern conceptions of utilitarianism, Benthamite utilitarianism, into Burke's thought when that idea was not a radical categorical concept as it has become today.
Right.
To Burke,
no, and I don't think Alevi had them in mind. Yeah.
No, sure, yeah. But that's why I hesitate to ascribe an ism to Burke's thought. But I think, in my judgment, to perfectly understand Burke, to understand him well, for him, there's this synthesis of utility that can be merged with these other elements, other parts of society that for him was sustainable over time. David, to your point, does he try to have it both ways? Promote utility, promote grace. I think he does thread a fine line between these two over utility and grace that for him, again, was sustainable. But as we've seen today, there's certain, and Harvey, this goes back to your comments, dimensions of utilitarianism that do intrude on those ideas of grace and dignity that cannot be reduced to commodification.
Before we say goodbye to Sam Moyne, Sam, do you have 90 seconds worth of final comment you'd like to make?
I prefer to hear as much of Jesse Norman as I can.
Good. So we're on to our third and last main speaker, Jesse Norman.
Well, how very kind of you to include me in this unbelievably distinguished and interesting gathering. It's an absolute delight. My reverence for it is even increased by the fact that my son Noah is indeed, although out this year, an undergraduate at your very fine university, and will be a junior when he returns next year. So it's a delight to have a chance. I must say today's a very unusual day to do a talk like this because we have literally just had a budget, and therefore the topic of economical reform and indeed the status of commercial society is very much in my mind at the moment. If I tell you that the Chancellor announced 8 free ports today in his budget, you will see the astonishing continuity of these issues over time. For me, I have the unfortunate requirement to spend most of my day job acting as a minister in the Treasury. So I have been, in fact, the Paymaster General, as Burke was. I'm now the Financial Secretary of the Treasury, and that means that I am absolutely responsible for issues of tax and tariffing that go squarely to some of the great 18th century debates that we've been discussing. And this does give it an additional pungency. And it also does raise the question as to what the standards should be when one is appraising the political economy of a commercial society in what you might call peacetime, and what the standards should be when one is appreciating it or reflecting on it in the face of a crisis. And that crisis might, as it is now, be a pandemic, or it might, as it was in Burke's time, be a revolution. And so, again, it's remarkably interesting to have a chance to discuss these issues. Let me just pick up a couple of themes. First of all, I must tell you that I thought this was a wonderful book. I really, really enjoyed it. And it's absolutely right that there have been precursors, Francis Canavan and Gertrude Himmelfarb, the ones that have been described. But I think you were not overstating the matter, David, when you said you thought this would be a book for a generation. And to read it was actually, I found myself repeatedly hitting myself over the head saying, why on earth, as it were, didn't this astonishing corpus of writings as directed to around the guiding idea of political economy. Why wasn't that something that I had picked up more of before? Because, and it's like all great strokes of genius, it seems amazingly obvious afterwards, but absolutely not beforehand. And I think it's brilliant of you, Greg, to have done that and pulled it together. And it doubly so because it's not just central, of course, to Burke, but it's also central to the 18th century. It helps us to guard against a couple of misinterpretations of Burke, I think, which you very nicely pinpoint. One is the idea of Burke as it were purely the creature of interest, the Namirite Burke, if you like. In some respects, the Macpherson Burke, and I think it very nicely, for reasons you describe, and they bear on, we'll come to that in a second, to issues of du commerce and moral imagination and mysticism even, but it just becomes completely impossible to conceive of Burke in those terms. And I can't say that without also mentioning the writings that you have done, David, and indeed Harvey, which bear directly on this issue. I think it's also impossible to see Burke as, in some sense, I mean, there's the category area of thinking him as a pre-capitalist. I think since capitalism doesn't exist in the 18th century, in at least the sense I would describe it, that is to say, as the accumulation of a market basis for economy and agglomerations of capital in the form of artificial persons or corporations doesn't really exist apart from state corporations such as the East India Company. I don't really think of, I think of everyone as pre-capitalist, but what Burke is not is pre-commercial society. Burke is a very, very sophisticated thinker about the issues that Adam Smith could think of as commercial society. And it's wonderful to see that brought out in so many different contexts as you have done, Greg. So that's another thing. Now, how should we think about Burke? And here I want to, if I may, run a contrast between Burke and Smith, or at least a comparison, and then use that to set up a question or two. So the first is this. I think you're absolutely right to take Burke seriously when he calls himself a philosopher, as it were, in practice. The politician is a philosopher in practice. I think it's a very specific reason why he says that, which is to say that the philosopher has to be someone who is, in some sense, as a matter of his or her own moral judgment, or as it were, poise, to have a degree of remoteness for any specific issue in order to be able to put them into a relation to each other and to any particular body of knowledge in order to put them into a relation with each other. And in a funny way, a politician must do the same thing. A politician who is only an economist is not a member of parliament, who could never be a member of parliament, who could never act in a representative function, let alone a ministerial one. A politician who's only an environmentalist, the same, because when it comes to building the airport or protecting the wetlands, there is no single metric on which that decision can be made. So you have to ascend a level and think in some more philosophical way about the relative claims to your judgment from both sides. So I think you're right to take that seriously, but there's no doubt that Burke is not, in the systematic sense, a philosopher in the way we think of as Smith. I want to talk about some areas where we might think they disagree and perhaps ask you to comment on some of those. So one you pinpoint nicely, Greg, which is different views about collusion in markets. So in Thoughts and Details, Burke seems very naive, and certainly compared to the Smithian reading, on which, as it were, they put any producers together and they start confabulating to raise prices. That's one issue. Another one obviously would be primogeniture and entails, where I take it they're on completely opposite sides of the argument. A third might be church and state, as has been discussed, where I think they're clearly on the opposite side of the argument. What is quite interesting, though, I would say, is to look at areas where to reinforce your view of the areas in which they overlap, and to say why. One obvious one is in their anti-utopianism, the rejection of the physiocrats by Smith, and the idea that you could never do justice to the functioning of a market economy, as we would call it, or commercial society, as he would call it, if you attempted to impose those standards of rigor that is associated with physiocracy. And Burke has the same thought in many ways in his denunciation of geometrical thinking as delusive. That I think is very common between the two. You will recall that Smith denounces faction and fanaticism in very Burkean terms towards the end of his life. What I think is more central, though, is the concept of exchange, and not just exchange, obviously, of goods and services. Smith, I think, extends that to a general theory which includes exchange of language and exchange of moral regard, but also to embed that itself, that whole conception of an exchange, in what you might call a moral imagination. So if I want to exchange anything from you, I have to have an understanding of, as it were, what it is like to be you, how you value what you have, how you value what I have, how you think I might be willing to trade what I have for what you have, and vice versa. So we're in a moral world. We've lost Sam sadly, but we're in a moral world when that happens. We're in a world of the imagination as well. And I think that does bear on some of the conversation, some of the discussion we're going to come to later when we think about du commerce and the potentially softening effects, because it's going to be, the thought is going to be that when you're inside this world of shared assumptions and shared moral imagination, the softening effects of du commerce can start to be felt. But it's almost precisely when you step outside them and you're in an international world where you may have, as it were, imperial instincts to satisfy. You may have exploitative tendencies that come out of different countries or different, as it were, administrations. Here one thinks of, the early work with William Burke, looking at the American colonies. So that, I think there's a relationship there. Let me just make a couple of other points and then stop. I think one aspect you haven't mentioned, which I think is interesting and important, is the extent to which Burke actually comes to this with the mind of the common lawyer. I think that's a very important aspect of it in a variety of different ways. One is because, of course, the common lawyer is automatically embedded in an understanding of society as accretive by a succession of cases. A second is because that then in turn leads into a conception of rights, which you'll recall Burke distinguishing abstract rights and recorded rights. And recorded rights are those that are compositions of experience and therefore carry with them these moral expectations that you might want. And then of course, you also have Burke's extreme preoccupation with property, and not just property meaning real property, but property as itself giving, it's very, as you know, it's a 16th, 17th century idea that property is the anchor of a man's freedom. And so that's I think that is a rather useful way of helping us to think about why there is, and of course, Smith himself had spent a considerable period of time thinking about jurisprudence. I think this is one of the undergirding ideas that ties the two of them together intellectually. So here's a couple of other questions. I mean, I'd be interested if you wanted to comment on any of that, but a couple of questions that just occurred to me. So I was thinking about it. First of all, I was very surprised, and in a rather pleased way, I went to see Hayek emerging so early in a book. I thought that was a ballsy move, if I may say so, and in a work of scholarship. And I liked it and I learned from it, but I thought it was interesting. And I thought what that did, which was really helpful, was bring out something actually that I argue for in my book on Smith, which is that in some respects, there is an Austrian feeling to what they are doing in modern economic terms, rather than a neoclassical feeling. We're not in the world of equilibrium. We're in the world of instability. We're in the world of emergent thinking and ideas and of dynamic human relationships, which I'm perfectly persuaded is the world of Smith. What's interesting is that Burke, paradoxically, seems to be more advanced than Smith. Smith can never disavow himself of his components of value theory, as it were, of which labor theory of value is one part. I mean, he runs both theories in The Wealth of Nations. He doesn't have a completely consistent theory of value, I would say, in The Wealth of Nations. But what is so interesting is that Burke is completely clear about what he thinks this is. And Burke, in a way, has the courage of the convictions that Smith has. Smith articulates this astonishingly modern policy framework for thinking about consumption as the ultimate value of as it were, economic activity, and that in turn you might think points, or history, it's important not to think of it as pointing, but history then allows that to be subsumed under the marginalist idea, which in some respects is I think a bastardization of Smith. But Burke has this idea very clearly in his mind that actually it's what we will believe something that is the ultimate source of value. So I think that's just very interesting. Second point is, you rightly focus on Burke's vindication of the middleman. in Thoughts and Details. I think is a very nice move. I'd just love you to comment a little bit on what he says about Jews in the Reflections, and also in Letter to a Member of the National Assembly, because I would love to think that he's using Jews in a purely descriptive way, that the man who could stand and defend the Jews of St. Eustatius, would be a man who would be using this almost as though he were using the word broker. But so there are really two questions. One is, the less interesting one is it anti-Semitic? We can come to that later. That's a separate question. But the really interesting one is there a shift in move, or what's the nuanced way of thinking about the middlemen of the one view and then the denunciation of the other works? Yeah. And then I suppose the final point was just to pick up the arguments about due commerce and the distinction there. And there I think I can't resist just quoting, because it links quite well to my opening remarks, Smith's line where, what does he say? Let me just find it. He says, here we go. If you remember, he reminds us that even where there may be an overlap or indeed a unification of interests through trade, nevertheless, trade remains subject to the short-term expedience of that insidious and crafty animal vulgarly called a statesman or politician. So I don't think either of them was naive when it came to the weaknesses of politics. And it is interesting that Burke, as a politician and especially as a common lawyer, has a capacity, and this may go to David's point about mysticism and utility. Burke is absolutely a man who will take what he's got coming to him, like a lawyer with a case. He'll use the case for purposes of winning the argument. And he has the same tendency to pick up a piece of thought and play with it and use it. And he's got such an astonishingly multi-layered and capacious mind that he can do that without fretting overly about whether or not there's going to be a perfect consistency, which he would in any case regard as the hobgoblin of little minds.
Thanks very much, Jesse, for those comments. All three presenters have kept well within the limits, making my job as moderator an example of du commerce, if ever there was one. Let me just point out and echo that concern about middleman, but Burke taking the other side against his later self from the appeal from the New to the Old Whigs, where he says the world is governed by middlemen. And that's said as a criticism. He's talking about politics there and the adventurers in composition like Paine and the people who purvey their ideas to the crowd. But it's interesting, he uses the same figure of speech. I don't know if you want to take that in, or if that seems an incidental point, but I'll leave you to comment now, Greg, and then I see a first question already from Stephen Smith. So we'll go to that after you respond to Jesse Norman.
Thank you. I should add here, I don't know if you're listening, this event was scheduled for 5:15, so should I make my comments very short? I don't know or can we continue talking? We can keep going, okay, great.
Yeah, we can keep going. When I get bored, we'll stop.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thank you, Jesse, for those very interesting comments. Before I continue further, I should, of course, mention that I mentioned this about Harvey, I am indebted, in the true Burkean spirit, I am indebted deeply to existing Burke scholars. David Bromwich, he served as the main advisor for this project. So thank you, David, as well. I have learned a great deal from your work on Burke. Brian Garston, another professor at Yale in the political science department, he, I believe, is listening, and he was another advisor for the project. So thank you, Brian, as well, for your perspective on political theory. And then Jesse, of course, I have learned a great deal from his work on Burke and on Smith as well. With regard to Jesse's comments, yes, Adam Smith. My original dissertation topic was going to be comparative study of Burke and Smith, and then until my advisor, David Walsh, who I should also mention, I owe a deep debt of gratitude for his guidance on this project. He wisely directed me to choose one thinker over the other, and because Burke's economic thought has not been given as much attention as Smith's, that's why I chose. That's one reason why I chose Burke. Differences between Burke and Smith. So even though they generally embrace the idea of market liberty, commercial prosperity, Jesse, you hit on a couple main sources of tension. One, church and state. Burke was a robust defender of the state establishment of a church. In the English and French context, it is a different question whether Burke would have supported a national establishment of a church in America if he were living today, based on his very conceptions of prudential awareness of a nation's history. But yeah, church-state relations, religion in general. Burke's former religious convictions, the Church of England, Smith's more watery religious sentiments, as well as his friend David Hume, and with specific regard to political economy as well. We haven't mentioned this yet, but the Navigation Acts were an integral concept to understand Burke's thought and Smith's thought as well. Without getting too much into the weeds of those laws, they were basically laws that intended to preserve the flow of British colonial trade within the British Empire. The modern iteration of those laws spanned back through the 17th century and some even earlier. Burke defended, in the 1770s, he continued to defend the prior system of the Navigation Acts emerging up to that 1760s period. He thought that the source of colonial disturbances emerged from the aggrandizement, the augmentation of those acts that increased its intrusive meddling into the American colonies. Burke himself thought at that time that a reversion back to the older system of the Navigation Acts would cool colonial emotions and continue to preserve the commercial interests of the colonists and Great Britain. Smith, I actually just wrote a piece on this, Smith's views on the Navigation Acts. He famously argues that defense is of much more importance than opulence in the Wealth of Nations, one of his most famous lines, thereby suggesting that Smith himself even recognized the importance of national defense at times over the maximization of commercial intercourse. Smith was not as committed to preserving the acts, I suggest, simply because it violated his vision of freedom of trade between independent nations. Burke was more keen on preserving those acts that he thought, again, the older form did not produce. It was a later form that emerged really with the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act. We're familiar with these events from American history and British history. That for him was the fuel for colonists' rebellion. In addition, Burke in 1769, in his observations on the late state of the nation, not as well known as some of his other works, but he does have a couple remarks on his awareness of the tendency of merchants to collude with one another, to enact regulations, anathema to the common good, and to serve the self-serving interests of the merchants themselves. And this is very, very similar to Smith's remark in Smith's more famous remark in The Wealth of Nations about how merchants collude together, or they advise governments to impose regulations and duties to advance their own commercial interest to the detriment of the common good. And in fact, just going back to the Freeport Act of 1766, Burke himself highlighted this piece of legislation as an example in which Burke and his fellow legislators convened a wide array of merchants with varying interests took into consideration their views on the appropriate commercial policy, and then synthesized them up into what he thought was a strong, if watered down, piece of legislation. So Burke was quite aware of this as well. But Jesse, to your point, in Thoughts and Details on Scarcity, he doesn't really mention this that much. He mentions in passing fraud, maybe, I forget if he mentions the word collusion in that writing. But he mentions in passing. That's why I mentioned when I critique him in my book, I say that he gives passing reference to this possibility of counterproductive economic activities that could have emerged between farmers and laborers in the agricultural economy. And there has been scholarship on this very idea that the supposedly smooth, harmonious relations in the agricultural economy at that time that Burke suggests in Thoughts and Details did not necessarily reflect reality in all situations. And in fact, I'm thinking of E.P. Thompson, some other scholars, from the 1760s through the 1790s, there was a string of bad harvests that provoked great instability at particular times in Britain's economy. And so that is one area that Burke is vulnerable, I think, to criticism when reading Thoughts and Details on Scarcity. Let's see. Oh yeah, Hayek and rationalism. Yes, I was thinking about whether to include Hayek in those early sections. The historians in the room probably shy away from doing so. I come from the background of political theorist, political philosopher. I tried to establish conceptual links, and I thought it was difficult to avoid this connection between Burke and Hayek based on their understanding of the limits of rationalism. However, in this, I actually adjusted this as I continued writing the book. I don't think Burke and Hayek were synonymous, and not simply because of Burke was more religious and Hayek was more agnostic leaning. As I detailed later in the book, Burke understands that there are these religious and moral preconditions to commercial activity, similar to the Pocockian thesis, that Hayek suggests but doesn't firmly articulate. He says in the Constitution of Liberty, he says that tradition and liberty are harmonious to some extent, but it's not clear to how Hayek distinguishes his idea of spontaneous order with the non-spontaneous institutions that built up society that led to commercial prosperity. And I just wrote a different piece on this, Burke's defense of the Church of England, Hereditary Aristocracy. It is difficult to read a conception of spontaneous order into these institutions, as well as the Navigation Acts, his defense of the East India Company. These were conscious attempts to preserve particular privileges in particular individuals of power that holds, I think, important tension with the idea of spontaneous order. Let's see. Well, you know what I mean. You want to open it up to some questions?
I was going to summarize a question or two.
Yeah.
First, offer you cheap defensive help on the question of Burke's anti-Semitism, but you can accept or not accept this help. It seems to me unquestionable that Burke in these writings of the 90s takes some opportunistic shots at Jews as a type. There's no reason to believe that he had become an anti-Semite since he was for Jewish, the abolition of disabilities for Jews in his earliest work, and there's no sign that he changed in between. But there are, I think one has to concede, touches of low propaganda in the anti-French writings, including the reflections. One of my nominees, which borders on the Jewish trope, if you will, is when he says, thinking about George Gordon in Newgate, let the Reverend Dr. Price compute the interest on 30 pieces of silver over 1,790 years. I mean, I actually can laugh at that. I dig it, but it's low. It's not worthy of Burke in a certain sense. So there's that. He's using it. He's opportunistic. But we have 3 or 4 questions centered on Christianity and chivalry. One from Brian Garston of Yale, but it chimes with another asked by John Snape of the University of Warwick Law School. Brian put it this way, he quotes you on clerical authorities and landed aristocrats being the guardians of commerce, but he asks, did Burke adequately take into account the possibility of commerce itself undermining the guardians? And this idea of something not easily reconcilable as between Christianity and Burke's understanding of commerce had come up in a couple of other questions, and maybe you'd like to meet those.
Yes, thank you, David. I'm reading them right now. Daniel Klein, thank you also, Brian, Stephen Smith, and John Snape. Yes, so first, for the historians in the room, we tend to read divisions between mobile and immobile property, commerce versus tradition and chivalry as these compartmentalized concepts. From my reading of English histories in the early modern period, and on the subject, but this is based on those readings. I think imposing these divisions does read modern conceptions of economics and tradition into that time period in which there were considered these harmonious connections between the landed interest and the mercantile commercial interests. And Burke's mentioned this repeatedly, that there is this harmonious connection that they provided counterbalance to one another, prosperity versus stability, change versus continuity. So historically speaking, in many ways, and this is not to diminish Burke's thought, but this was a reflection of the historical time period in which these supposedly separate parts did have these interdependent connections that for us moderns does seem a little odd. In terms of insofar as we can characterize commerce as modern as opposed to pre-modern. I do think, right, he is certainly aware that commercial utilitarianism could undermine those traditions, as he articulates in Reflection on the Revolution in France, which is why he's so adamant on defending the Church of England, primogeniture, Jesse, to your point, which Smith was skeptical of, criticized, and the importance of the hereditary aristocracy. For him, these could be bulwarks against the crasser, baser effects of modern commercialization. Now, is this argument convincing to today? He's certainly vulnerable to criticism. Was he too optimistic about this supposed harmony, about the apparent reconciliation between these two aspects of society? That is certainly an open question. From Burke's frame of mind, he thought they could be reconciled, and for him, as long as you preserved the spirit of gentleman, the spirit of tradition, spirit of religion, as he understood, deriving from Christian ancestral traditions and moral traditions, that could sustain society even if it did not reach its optimal capacity for commercial prosperity. In terms of, go ahead, Dave.
No, why don't you complete this answer on Christianity, and then I was just going to ask for some final comment if Harvey Mansfield and Jesse Norman would like to give one, but go ahead and finish. Yeah.
I was going to say, and also, right, in terms of Christianity, the typical division is that there was a scriptural affirmation of the dignity of labor in itself. The idea of commercial activity, financial speculation, and this goes to Jesse, your point, your comment about the idea of the middleman. This is where it gets trickier. Scholastic theology, did in some ways have this sort of modern pre-classical conception of the importance of subjective value in transactional exchange, but they did retain this Aristotelian Thomistic conception of commercial exchange as important insofar as it leads to a grander teleological conception of social order. Burke, I think, retained this teleological idea, but he argued in his commentary on middlemen that it could be reconciled in a way as long as middlemen themselves understood their function as middlemen, not as statesmen, not as philosophers, not as theologians, not as clergy. Dave, this goes to your comments as well. And this reminds me of this,
in the university context, we could think of them as administrators.
Yes, yeah. And this reminds me too that his quotation, I believe in his speech on Fox's India Bill, the situation of man is a preceptor of his duties, if I remember correctly. Each person has a particular role in society, not that he held a static conception of society, but insofar as you held the role at a particular time, you held particular functions and responsibilities. It was your role to fulfill those responsibilities. It was also your role not to go beyond those responsibilities and assume duties that were not commensurate with your position. If middlemen preserve their function in an agricultural economy, facilitate the smooth coordination of goods and services, then he was a robust defender of them. And Jesse, to your comments earlier, Burke defended the Jewish people after the British plunder of St. Eustatius Island in 1781. He identified the Jewish people as promoting these capital markets, credit markets, facilitating this exchange of commerce throughout the world. For him, conclusion, if you have middlemen, speculators, assuming different responsibilities that go beyond the particular functions, that is when wreaks social havoc and undermines civil stability.
Harvey Mansfield, would you like to? You've been very disciplined and said less than I know you are capable of. Do you want to say anything in conclusion or comment on these comments?
Oh, a little bit. This is a book on commerce and manners. Commerce is exchange according to the laws of economics, which are rational and natural, apply everywhere. And manners are conventions that differ from one society to another. And so it's nature and convention that he brings together in this book. And so impressive that, what we today call the economy as a separate entity was a recent invention at the time of Burke, done by the preceding generation, or especially seen in the political philosophy of John Locke, and the creation of the city, which still exists as a separate authority from the sovereign political authority. And on the other hand, the need to bring together these two disparate elements, commerce and manners, which is reflected in the phrase political economy. So I'm just so impressed with the way Greg has done this in this book, and the erudition that he shows in the book and also in his comments today. It's an accomplishment, a real attainment.
Jesse Norman, any last comment?
I mean, I could never speak after Harvey after comments of that quality, because he's precisely identified the genius of the book and the nature of the contribution that it makes. I would just add one thing, which is there's a line of Burke's that I always think is a key to understanding him, which is where he says that circumstances give to every political principle its distinguishing color and discriminating effect. And I always think it is that interplay between principle and context, and the fact that very similar appearing contexts may elicit different principles, and the balance to be struck between those two things, alongside the tensions and the resolution that Burke brings to the ideas of commerce and manners that lie at the center of his thinking. And let me leave it there. So, but thank you so much, Greg. I've really enjoyed this, and I really enjoyed the book.
And let me just conclude this with my congratulations. I realize I tempered it too mildly in my opening remarks, and say that I'm proud to be associated with this book in any way as an advisor, certainly not a preceptor. It is a comprehensive achievement, and I hope for all who have been listening or people who listen to this as a recording that it will add something to the book. And I think all of us who participated recommend the book. So with that, I think we'll just close this, and thank you, Greg Collins, Harvey Mansfield, Jesse Norman, all for participating. And we'll say thanks even in his absence to Sam Moyne, who had to leave early. So farewell to all.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.